So what we are trying to do at this time, to the extent that we are able to accomplish it, that in the three remaining Fridays, because we took one Friday off, we will discuss some essential messages and features of the esoteric tradition in several places. The one from America tonight, and the one from France next time. And I'll be darned if I can remember what the third one is going to be.
Future.
Which one?
The development and future.
Yeah, the future. Well, that's always, it's always important to foretell the future, because that's the most difficult. However, no one can contradict you until it happens. So that makes it rather easy. In any event, at this time, we need to keep, I think, two very important issues in mind at the outset. And one of them is, of course, that everything that exists, everything that we can discern in life, has a history, has a past. It came from somewhere before it got here, and it has a story. The very sort of silly English word history, which can be played with, is a good example, because it has been said that it's not his story, it's our story. In any event, that is an important issue, and to it, of course, are joined many others. And so, let's say it has been, how should I put it? It has been murmured and rumored in various circles for a long time that the foundation and much of the subsequent history of the Republic of the United States had esoteric elements in it. And this has always been there, sort of in the background. And at this particular time, we need to keep in mind, let me see, I probably have something written. We need to keep in mind that when we look at the history subsequent to the foundations and before it, Declaration of the Independence, all of those things, practically to the present day, there has always been a heterodox, semi-mystical or quasi-mystical esoteric element active in the United States, sometimes more prominently than others, but it was always there. To my great delight, we have with us tonight my longtime friend John, who is so modestly tucked away over there, and largely in his company and in the company of his dear departed wife, we drove up and down the Hudson Valley a number of times, which is really the cradle of much of American esotericism. And if you kept track of all the unusual and strange movements, many of which are no longer with us, but others are very much with us, like the Mormons, because Joseph Smith had his start there in the Hudson Valley also. It's from there that he went to the Salt Lake and so forth. unusual prophetic persons and unusual movements came forth from there like from a cornucopia. And then, of course, also spread all over the United States and fulfilled various functions. So just on a strictly factual and historical basis, it cannot be denied that the unusual, the weird, the unconventional, the heterodox element of spirituality and intellectuality was represented in the United States very early, clear back to the time of the Dutch and thereafter, and that it has never really gone out of business. And so probably more so than almost any other country that I could name, the United States has in its developmental fabric a strong esoteric element, which has not only never gone away, but which of course modified itself and accommodated itself to various trends and situations, but was always there. And so, let's say the much touted and heralded term New Age is a falsehood, because there's nothing new about it. Especially as far as America is concerned, the constituent elements of what for the last few decades would have passed as New Age philosophy and so forth. Before that, others has been here practically from the very earliest times of the American Republic. And there must be understandable and valid reasons for that. No doubt there are some that are quite rational and that we can readily agree to, namely that people came here because they didn't want to stay where they were, right up to the present time. I came here that way, you know. And but when you amplify that a little, then you can say that the conditions, particularly the conditions of that relate to the existence and the work and the treatment of more or less unconventional spiritual teachings and movements, was entirely different and much more free in this country, especially after the American Republic was formed and when the freedom of religion, or let's say a form of a freedom of religion, was proclaimed in the United States that was not in existence anywhere in the world. This was the most wide, the most promising, the most comforting kind of religious freedom that existed anywhere in the world. For the majority of countries were culturally conditioned, and as it always is, an important part, an important foundation of their culture was of a religious nature. And therefore, in many places, the religion of the country was a state religion, as it almost happened here, but the founders of the American Republic knew that that very close association between state and religion had not been a beneficial one, and had actually been a problem in many, many countries, and was a problem at that time, and they did not want to cause the same kind of problem here. And so, let's say, the very wide religious freedom, which was proclaimed quite early, redounded to the benefit of all manner of intellectual and spiritual inspiration that came to various people, and therefore prophets and teachers and visionaries and mediums at certain historical period abounded in the country and were able to continue their work, to supply their trade without hardly any interference. And in this respect, we really ought to keep in mind that this development which took place, which formed already quite early, even before independence, but of course continued, was virtually unique in the world and redounded to the development of a spiritual creativity in this country to a very major extent. So, beginning with some of the early immigrants, among whom frequently are mentioned pilgrims and subsequently developed Puritans. We had, you might say, the most radical and unusual and peculiar religious groups from Europe, primarily from England, because of the language affinity come to this country. And this in itself, I think, is quite important, is quite significant. Now, let's say the Pilgrims and maybe more the Puritans, who are not the same. Before I learned a little bit of American history, which I was never taught in school where I grew up, I came to recognize that they were different. And of course, as an antagonistic source said, the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, but considering some of their teachings and some of their proclivities, it might have been better if Plymouth Rock landed on them. So that's the antagonistic comment, which is not without foundation. However, just from my own personal idiosyncratic point of view, there's one thing that I really love about the Pilgrims. What? That they drank unbelievably large quantities of hard cider. I mean, you know, in later periods, under Calvinist influence and things like that, the drinking of alcohol often being frowned upon by religious groups. The Pilgrims considered it a wonderful thing, and they also felt that it was very healthy. The more alcohol you drank, the healthier you would be. Well, you know, I am not a doctor, I am not a pilgrim, so I have no way of relating myself to that in any fashion, but they certainly did. And they passed some of that inclination on to others. It was only comparatively recently publicized, for instance, that the romantic figure of Johnny Appleseed, of whom almost everybody heard. That Johnny Appleseed, who went around the country most of the time on a raft on the rivers, and who planted apples. As to the motivation of his desire to plant apples, you may think, oh well, how nice, that's how we came by a beautiful Macintosh apples in the market and all of that. No, Johnny Appleseed planted apples because he wanted apple cider to be present all over the country, which of course it was, and the cider of course was always processed in such a way that it contained a good deal of alcohol. But these are all sort of flibbertigibbet statements which I thought might act as a little romantic and perhaps alcoholic introduction to our subject, and so I'll move on from it. Let's say one of the great problems of peoples all over the world, everywhere, certainly not just in Europe or not just in England, but everywhere in Asia and Middle East and everywhere else, has been throughout history religious intolerance, and still is. I think that few of us who don't read certain kinds of literature are aware, for instance, of the tremendous amount of religious persecution that is going on at the present time in Africa, mainly directed against Christians who have been, of course, converted by various people mainly from Europe, but otherwise too. So let's say right up to this time, religion and the fanatical, uncomprehending and uncharitable attitudes of religious people have caused a tremendous amount of trouble, a tremendous amount of suffering. So undoubtedly, the founding fathers of the American Republic were very aware of this, and they tried to prevent a situation developing in the United States which would lead to the kind of religious intolerance and persecutions that existed elsewhere, not only in Europe but in other parts of the world. So let's say there were good and sufficient reasons why the keynote was introduced very early of no established religion, but that rather people were to enjoy the widest religious freedom, as I said, that was available in the world, and that no one should be persecuted for his religion, or even treated in a manner unbecoming a full-fledged citizen because of his or her religious views. Now, this was a very, very important matter, and still is. And the, let's say, the intellectual and spiritual development of the overwhelming majority of the citizens of this country, I think, can be traced back to the great religious freedom and to various developments ensuing therefrom. And the creativity, the religious creativity, which is the result of religious freedom, certainly flourished in this country greatly. All right. That is one foundational element of what we are talking about that made the existence and the activities and the continuation of the esoteric current, of the esoteric tradition possible, and at times even on the verge of popularity in the United States. So we'll stop that at that particular point, and now we'll move to another one, which is probably a little more controversial right to the present time, and is also, let's say, politically an extremely powerful and creative idea which came to great fruition in this country and which is still, let's say, in the forefront of attention. And what was that? The idea of democracy, which in turn is of Greek origin and just simply means, as Plato, and I'll just mention you in the minute how, in a very interesting context, Plato mentioned it, and it had to do that there are several ways of ruling a country. There can be a monarchy of a single monarch, king, queen, or whatever other title they may bear. There is an aristocracy, which is wherein the ruling crust of society is made up of people who usually by their own decision, but sometimes at least by the acquiescence of the rest of the people, are regarded as the aristoi, or the best of society. Now, the idea behind it being that before you are going to run a country or even a province, you should be somebody important. You should be conscious, as we might call it in contemporary times, of more elements of life, public and private, than most other people. In other words, you should be better informed, better trained than other people. So that was the second, which Plato incidentally favored quite a bit. And then, of course, there is the one that I think only very few people favor throughout history, which in Greek is called tyrannis, which means a tyrant. The democracy, aristocracy, and tyranny. These were the three recognized forms of government by the Greeks. And the Greeks' orientation, of course, was greatly influenced by their spiritual traditions, their spiritual ideas, and of the other Mediterranean countries, particularly the great land of mystery and wisdom, Egypt, than in any other way. So this needs to be kept in mind. Now, is there a deeper, a more desirable, a more profound side or aspect to the idea of democracy than we generally recognize? We might even say, from our esoteric point of view, is there something spiritual about democracy? Well, if somebody asked me just kind of on the street, and I'm not in the habit of answering questions on the street, let us say, I would say, well, I'm not so sure, because what passes for democracy nowadays is anything but spiritual, and much of the time not to my liking. But that's my own individual point of view. Aside from that, is there something there that we don't detect? And I think there is. What we generally don't detect is that there is let's say, a transcendental root of the basic democratic idea. And that transcendental root has to do, I'm sorry, Christian people or Jewish people, if you don't like this, but this is primarily due to the spiritual foundations, the deepest aspects of the polytheistic religions of the Greeks, of the Romans, and primarily of the Egyptians. Now, what kind of crazy thing am I saying here? Well, let's put it this way. If you were a run-of-the-mill Greek person in the Peloponnesus, you had probably in your mind a possibility of becoming more than human. Now, talk about aristocracy, you know. And what was that? That if you led a very deep life, which was cognizant of the profundities of human life, of human belief, of human aspiration, then you came to recognize that if you practiced what the Greeks and the Romans called the virtues of a human to a very great degree, then you would become what was known as a hero. Not a hero of the battlefield necessarily, although battlefields were always there and heroes were always there, because that's part of the shadow of human life, that as long as there are humans on earth, they're going to be fighting each other. As long as there are humans on earth, they're going to be killing each other. They're going to be maiming each other. As an old Bavarian country song, the refrain says, "'Twas immer so, so." It was always such. Oh, I know that's not a very optimistic view of human life, but I think it is a realistic one. However, this heroism is something else. It is the power to practice the highest qualities of human consciousness to a heroic degree. And if you are able to do that, then you are moving from the ordinary, from the ranks of ordinary humanity to something else. And what is that? Then you are declared and recognized by the spiritual leadership as a hero. A hero who has practiced the human virtues to an optimal degree. And I think there are very few of us who can say that, even if we knew by this time in history what the human virtues are, because of the historical developments. And then, however, it was also recognized that by becoming a person of such heroic consciousness, as we would call it nowadays, you are then on the borderland of yet another state of being. And this other state of being was that among the Greeks, who are maybe the easiest ones to refer to, was called the world of the demigods. In other words, you were human, but you had also released within yourself a potential that is more than human. And this is something for us to contemplate. I know that since Nietzsche, I think there has been a sort of a slogan of human all too human. Menschliches und Übermenschliches. Bitte schön? Ja. Alltoo, yeah, too human, alles menschlich. But this is beyond that. The Greeks, and before them the Egyptians, and subsequently at least some of the Romans and so forth, recognized that there is there's a borderland between that which is purely human, an earthly consciousness, and that which is beyond. And one of the reasons for this is that it was generally recognized that we, as minds, that's not a very good expression, as minds, as spirits, as souls, have come from a state of existence, from a state of being that is different, that is divine, and that is more than human, that is transhuman. And since we have come from there, we still have within us the capacity to recover some of that condition. But it requires a heroic soul to do so. We have to become heroes of consciousness. We have to become heroes of, we have to exercise the spiritual strength, which is the meaning of virtue. Virtus in Latin means a certain kind of superhuman strength. It has, I'm sorry to say, feminists, it also has a relationship to the Latin word vir, which means a man, a male. So it's the, let's say, virtuousness was in part attributed by the ancients to the masculine character, for which reason, well, probably women were often not considered virtuous, and that very fact was a great joy to the men. So let's just kind of leave it at that point, you know. But whichever way we want to turn it, the issue was that now there came a condition which the ancient Greeks and others would have referred to as really being on the threshold of divinity. In other words, people like that are able to be human and possibly quite fully human in various respects, but at the same time have a portion of their consciousness in the divine. A kind of very unfortunate analogy comes to my mind, which I will mention even though I consider it unfortunate, and that is that it's sort of like a seafaring vessel which has an upper portion but maybe has the capacity of submerging in the great divine ocean, so it's capable of being outside of the divine ocean and within it. And as such, let's say, the alchemists would have a lot to say about that, because to be fully human means to become at least partially divine. This was the belief of the polytheistic religions. And that is why I think the, how should I put it, the unjustifiably high regard of our culture throughout its history for monotheism as against polytheism is mistaken. A lot of the difficulties of our culture flow from the monotheistic God image. And the polytheistic God image of the ancients had great and important potential and has a great deal to do with what we are talking about now. Now I am all too slowly leading to my point, as is often my wont to do. And that is the fact that we, owing to our ultimate essential nature, our essential essence, which is an ancient Greek word, we are human, but also more than human at the same time. We can re-become, because the mythologies usually tell us that we were once, we can re-become divine again if we work at it and if we do it. And that is where the realm of the demigods and the demigoddesses was envisioned by the ancients. Now, of course, I'm sure that you realize that such ambitious people as the Greeks and maybe the Egyptians would not stop at that point, and they would say, yes, and after that you become gods and goddesses. And that is why so many of the ancient deities had human-like characters. I mean, you know, Zeus, who becomes Jupiter among the Romans, Zeus really liked to have fun, you know, and maybe we ought to take that into account. Be if our Jung would call it the God images would be a little more fun-loving, a little more like Zeus and others, then we would be a little more fun-loving too. But if we worship a sourpuss deity, then the likelihood is great that we will have more and more bitter and sour people on earth as well. But here are the various stages. See, human and demigod, demigoddess, and the immortals, the gods. Because one of their chief characteristics whereby they're always described when possible, the immortal gods. This goes clear into Latin and so forth. Because the mortality being connected with a physical body and with earthly life is something that can be overcome. But it can only be overcome by what I was just described, which the Greeks called theosis, and which in other context also became called an apotheosis, the deification. All right. Now, this being the case, what conclusions can we draw from that for American esotericism? You might say, oh, the old boy is really talking far-fetched stuff tonight, you know. But this is the conclusion, I think, the principal conclusion, that owing to this dual nature, human and divine, of the or earthly and divine of the human being, there needs to be a development. In other words, people don't do this without inducement, without training, without various practices. People don't become demigods and gods just because they want to be. They have to do things for it. They have to have spiritual practices. They have to have the mysteries. They have to have various activities and engagements which will help them to re-become divine. Now then, that being the case, what can they do? And one of the things that they can do and that they should do is to develop their innate faculties, physical, intellectual, emotional, and ultimately spiritual. Because we have within us the potential of the theosis, of the re-becoming divine again. But this potential has to be realized. If it is not realized, then, well, nothing happens. Now then, going a little bit further than that, how will it be realized? Well, for one thing, the Greeks already hit on the idea that if people have more abilities to develop their talents, if they are guided into the direction of their own spiritual heroism and ultimately deification, if they work on that, they can indeed move in that direction. And that means, among other things, that they have to recognize and practically recognize one important fact, that spiritual heroism, demigod status, and divine status are individual status. You have to do that individually. Or you can gather in groups of students or of practitioners like the mysteries, but within that setting, let's say within the setting of the Eleusinian mysteries, the really transforming, the really deifying mystery was always experienced individually by people. Now we are getting close to the situation, namely that people should have a society, people should have a country wherein they live, where their individuality is recognized and cultivated and ultimately brought to fruition. They should not live in the country where their individuality, for whatever reason, is suppressed. Why? Because by suppressing the individuality, the potential apotheosis and theosis of the individual is suppressed. This is where Christianity was taken on an unfortunate bypass. It became too collective. It became too mass-minded. It was too much oriented toward groups. Well, history works that way. When the Christian monks trudged into the Germanic forests, eating acorns like a porker, and things like that, they had to have results for their conversion experiences. And so the easiest thing to do is to change, when you want to change somebody, to want to change a person's behavior and his thinking, with which is consciousness, with which is bound up, let's say, the emotional as well. So that's readily done. You tell people, look here, Hans, the Germanic barbarian in the oak forest. If you don't behave, you're going to be in a bad way. You are never going to develop into a good saintly person. You're going to go to hell, and so on and so forth. So let us say and how do you do that? The whole bunch of you, your family, your tribe, your nation, come over here and we pour some water over your head, and then that will give you the capacity to be good. And when you're good, then you're saved, and you're going to go to heaven. So let us say we might almost say of necessity, the great cultural change which came upon the Mediterranean region and the northern regions too, as the result of the coming of Christianity, had inadvertently fostered a collectivism. The ecclesia, which means the coming together, the community, the people together. And this was interpreted as a whole bunch of people who believe the same things, who follow the same commandments, who have the same spiritual practices, and who therefore, for the most part, are going to go to heaven. The ancients didn't have that attitude. Now again, I shouldn't be too categorical about it, because there were Dummkopf, as we call them in German, in classical antiquity, a Dummkopf, a stupid head, as much as in later times. So let's say, the collective person, the group-minded person, the party member, and I don't mean a party in the Hollywood Hills or something, but also the other one. These are all the common characteristics of the human race, which, however, do not lead to the desired end. The desired end being making contact with that mysterious, that deific world where the gods and the goddesses live, and where the ultimate creative and transforming power resides. The ancients, whether they were Egyptians, whether they were Greeks, whether they were Persians, whether they were Romans, they all had an orientation toward that. They knew that there was a potential which could be cultivated and which would make, in modern psychological terms, a great and total transformation in the individual. This is a big difference. It's okay to behave well. And I think any of you who have children, who have contact with children, would say well-behaved children are a lot easier to deal with than nasty, ill-behaved children, of course. And so it is. That's true. But behavior, rules and regulations, commandments don't transform. They don't transform. They may keep the various forces within an individual within certain bounds. But the person who has become very law-abiding, who listens to everything that comes out of the White House from Washington, well, maybe not little envelopes with some white powder in it like you hear right now, so forth, they don't change. They may be easier to manage. And that's why they are being indoctrinated. That's why they are being induced that if they behave in a certain way, then they are going to be in great shape. because that is to the benefit of those whom they are going to serve. But let's say it is my conviction, and certainly that's the only one that I can voice, that at the background, as the French call it, au fond, at the foundation of the ancient spiritual systems of the Greeks, of the Egyptians, who were very, very highly regarded, to a certain extent of the Romans, Persians, and others, there was a conviction. They knew a secret that later on was lost. And what was that secret? It's very, very easily said in 3 words. Thou art God, or a God, or a goddess. That doesn't mean that you have the divine powers at this point, but that you have the potential to re-become what you once have been in the great and mysterious kingdom which the Greeks symbolized as Mount Olympus. And what a beautiful idea. I often sort of, when I try to be a little bit happier, when I envision the ancient Greeks walking on the foot of the mountain, and up above there are thunderings and lightnings, and then the sun comes shining, and then things quiet down, and when they listen very carefully, what do they hear? Laughter, laughter. The gods are laughing. The gods are happy. Why? Because they have attained to that without which we will never be happy, which is the only thing that gives happiness, is namely our own, as Madame Blavatsky named it once, our own divine and immortal soul, our essence, our ultimate nature. That is, it cannot do anything else but be happy. Why? Because it is authentic. That is the ultimate place of authenticity. You are not yourself until you are divine. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try other things. But, and of course, it depends greatly on your definition of the divine. Now, this being the case, there is a mundane conclusion which I alluded to already, and that mundane conclusion is that what can you do now, while you are here trying to become a hero, trying to become a demigod, trying to do all of these things, what can you do? How are you to comport yourself? And I think the rather obvious answer to it is that you have to be an individual. You have to be yourself, by which ultimately is meant your true self. What in the theosophical system maybe is called the Atman. You have to, and the thing is, you might say, but that's terribly difficult. But it's not so terribly difficult, because in a strange, mysterious, uncanny way, you are that already. So what you must strive for is to bring forth, to re-envision, to be reborn into that deific world, and then you are your real self. Now then, can you do that if you are living under a tyrant, under Plato's tyrannies? Not very likely. And not too many people were able to work effectively, say, on their spiritual lives in Soviet Russia, you know that darn well, or in today's China, or in Nazi Germany for that matter. So you have to live within a setting, you have to live within a system where you have the freedom to develop, to grow, to transform, to, as Carl Jung would call it, individuate. Because one of the terms that has been used for the recovery of this deific state is individuation, becoming self, becoming your true self. And of course the German works into it because an individuum is an indivisible unity. But that is, so if at all possible, you should find yourself in a situation where you have the ability and the means whereby to change in the right direction, to become your true self, to become more and more closely related with your divine and immortal soul, and thereby, let us say, sort of graduate out of the elementary class of ordinary humanity. See? Now, that being the case, I think it would stand to reason that knowledgeable and skilled members of what we often refer to as the esoteric tradition were desirous of a country, of a social situation, of a government that would facilitate that. And yet, much of the time they could not find it. Because the political systems in the Middle East, in Europe, in all kinds of places, were of a different nature. And therefore, now finally I'm coming to my point, therefore, there was a secret tradition within the esoteric tradition itself. And that secret tradition said, we have to find a country, we have to find a government, we have to find a social setting within which we can become what we are supposed to become, and where we, if you want to use that term as much abused term, where we will be free to become what we ought to become. And so they looked around. Here they were, the old Rosicrucian fathers in Germany, and various mystics here and there and everywhere. And they looked around. Well, nothing like that is around here. I mean, in some places it's a little better, in other places it's a lot worse. But that's the way it is. And so what did they do? They say, somewhere there is a place. Somewhere there is a land. Somewhere there is a continent where this could be done. And they called it various names. They called it the New Atlantis, which is a little bit strange because Atlantis supposedly went down under the waters. But anyway, let's not worry about that at this point. But anyway, that there is a place, and we tend to envision everything physically. There is a place, there is a continent, there is a land which would be suited for the accomplishment of this. And since then, people have been looking. And when they looked enough, then they went there. And when they went there, then at least some of them recognized, this is the place, this is the place. Here we can do it. Here we can do it. Here is that there is not going to be a Grand Inquisitor or Thomas Torquemada looking down our throat and burning us at the stake. We'll be able to be free. We'll be able to pursue our spiritual destiny. We can become what in olden days we called the heroes and then the demigod. We will be able to do it. And that's how America was discovered. Now, if you think that that's a bit of an excessive statement, a little bit of too superlative, well, maybe it is. But I wasn't really convinced of it until I read a good deal of this book by Mr. Manly. Manly Palmer Hall had, you might say, unearthed the almost countless items of evidence that indicate that this kind of an aspiration, this kind of a hope, and eventually this kind of activity did go on and led to the discovery of America and ultimately to the foundation of the United States. Now, I know that especially in more recent decades, all kinds of balderdash. That's one of my favorite words. You know, I only have one, but maybe they'll make me more. I have a nice little button that you can wear that says balderdash on it. You know. So let's say there was a secret understanding, and Mr. Hall quotes the authorities. They are English, they are German, they are French, and they all had an orientation toward that kind of a future. And then, with the ability of humans for safe seafaring actions, the possibilities increased, and a number of people at different times landed in a strange place in the uttermost west, as J.R.R. Tolkien would call it, and eventually came to establish themselves and their families and their followers therein. Now, Mr. Hall makes a very good case, copied, of course, from other existing sources, for instance, that Christopher Columbus was privy to the kind of information that indicated that there was such a promising continent in the uttermost west, and that he received some of this indoctrination or some of this information from existing esoteric sources. I have heard this already a long time ago, before I read Manly Hall's book, that the designs, symbols are more important than words. Symbols are even more important than deeds, because symbols have their own reality. They are the key that opens up realities that otherwise are inaccessible to us. And in this case, the design of the crosses that you can see even now in the depictions of the ships of Christopher Columbus are an exact replica of a cross that was used extensively sometimes before, and you know who it was used by? The Knights Templar. The Knights Templar, in turn, who were one of the great crusading orders, people who picked up a little bit too much esotericism for their own good when they were in the Middle East from the Sufis and other almost said the sophisticated people. I like puns, and in any event, they picked up various, not so that terribly different, but they picked up some esoteric doctrines which they then brought to Europe, and they were eventually found out, and other historical factors came in, and then they were. Their leadership was exterminated, and the order was closed down. But there were some who still knew some of that tradition. There were some who were secret Templars. And one of them, Italian boy from sunny Italy by the name of Cristoforo Colombo, went over to Spain, to the famous couple wherein Castile and Aragon united, the first union of Spain of Ferdinand and Isabella, and he presented some things to them that probably never became public, and that impelled particularly Isabella. You got to give the women credit; they've got intuition. I said, what? This Italian guy is going somewhere. He's going to accomplish something important. So they financed the venture, and here were the ships with the Templar cross on it, who eventually reached the Americas and began the entire process of an esoteric impulse behind the very discovery of the American continent, and an esoteric impulse that was present in various details for a long, long time ever after. And I think that I have all kinds of glorious quotations here, but you can get that book, and one of you is going to get it free. In which you will see how these developments took place. So it was Mr. Manly Hall's contention, and from all the evidence that I have seen in various sources, I solely agree with him that the discovery of America by way of Christopher Columbus himself and his associates had a strong, secret, esoteric foundation. That what these people wanted to discover was not just a place where you can start farms and where you can eventually build factories, which of course they wouldn't have known and so forth, but where the great secret of the esoteric tradition, of the possibility of the recovery of the divine nature of the human might be realized. And where the first great step in that direction being that there is no established religion. There is no inquisition, there are no preachers who are going to throw you in jail. Well, I must confess that there was a little bit of it with our poor friends, the witches, back in Massachusetts. But even there, in America, they never burned witches. Okay? They found other ways of doing away with it. But they never burned witches. So let's say religious intolerance certainly existed on the American continent too, but never by way of the establishment of American society. Once American society did establish itself. So a setting was created. Everything needs a setting. If you don't have, I'm still back in that era. If you don't have a nice desk and some nice pens, you're probably not going to write anything important. We say, well, what about the computer? Well, Maybe. There is no mechanical wisdom. It has to come out of. So there has to be a setting. There have to be instruments, and these were then developed. Now, of course, I know that in recent times, I mean, they don't want to celebrate Columbus Day in New York and things like that. The objections that are raised to the persons and to the activities of some of these early discoverers are of no real consequence. Certainly, with the conquest, there will be various battles, there will be oppressions, there will be all kinds of things. And they always have been. When a later time, whom I'm not going to leave out, I'm not going to leave out my beloved Alexander the Great, but in a later time, when you come to another culture, to another land, there will be conflict. And certainly there were conflicts in the course of the conquest of the Americas, as there were conflicts in the conquest of India, or in the conquest of Africa, or in the conquest of anything. Because when a new culture moves in somewhere, the existing culture might take objection to that, and yet eventually things will, so to say, work out. I'm trying to think. I'm thinking of a picture which is not of Picasso, but who was the other great Spanish painter? Maybe, there is a this is the gentleman. This is the Salvador Dali. That's right, with the beautiful mustache. The poor man died in his burning house as an old man. But in any event, Salvador Dali, among his many paintings, has one symbolic painting, which is the Conquista of America. And there are the, if you haven't seen...
America by Christopher Columbus.
Yeah, by Columbus.
The discovery of America is the one that Dali did. That is extraordinary.
Yeah.
He was a friend of mine.
Oh, well, good. I liked everything by Dali that I've seen. But this is the one where the ships are coming in on the ocean to the land, and through the air fly these incredible, extraordinary, angelic beings carrying banners and carrying crosses and trumpets. Something has come. Something has come now to establish itself in this land and to do its own thing.
The painting is 2.5 stories high.
That's how big the original is.
Yeah. A friend of mine commissioned him to do that.
Uh-huh.
And then I wanted to buy it because he had to sell it at some point.
Well,
it was beautiful. It's in Florida, though.
Oh, that's where it is. Uh-huh.
Thank gosh. It's 2.5 stories high in the middle
My
of the
goodness,
museum.
well, listen, thank you for the information.
It's the most beautiful.
I know I
one of my
was,
favorite paintings
when I saw reproductions of it, I was totally taken with it. In any event, he said that there's something spiritual, something ghostly, something other than ordinary that has arrived and is coming now and is going to establish itself, and it has all kinds of esoteric symbolism connected with it. So that's a pictorial representation of really what went on. And now then, obviously I don't have the opportunity or the time to go into too much detail, but let's say I assure you that if you or I would dig up the majority of the available evidence, you would find that the huge, the overwhelming majority, the greatest numbers of people who arrived from various countries and who eventually constituted the United States of America had esoteric inclinations. So a disproportionately high number, when they're going to the real early American settlers were heterodox spirituality and often of esoteric inclinations, particularly of Rosicrucian origins, but also of others. And that is why I guess all of the weirdos went to the Hudson Valley, the shakers and the breakers and whatever. Everybody was there. But why? Because it attracted the unusual spirituality, and that continued right down to the present New Age and everything in between. Everywhere where if you look in a good esoteric historian is actually just arrived in Los Angeles. I mean, he's been here periodically. He's going to give a lecture at Philosophical Research Society tomorrow, namely Mitch Horowitz. Mitch Horowitz is in town. See, in any event, he's was very good on digging up all these details too. That the heterodox, the unusual, the mystical, magical came and kept coming. And as Mr. Hall points out, in many places they didn't come to tabula rasa, let us say, either, because, let's say, much of what I still call it American Indian spirituality had its own esoteric aspects. And so you might say it was an esoteric land. It was a mystical land. The very land itself had great, strange prophetic figures that came from the Indian tradition, like Quetzalcoatl in Mexico and others. So let's say they didn't come to a materialistic, secularized society. They came to places where shamanism was flourishing. They came to the places where well, I'm not going to go into details, but let's say the peace pipe occasionally may have contained substances that really made you peaceful, and so forth. In other words, there is always a foundation, So that being the case, that was the beginning, and then they kept coming. And a very large number of those who kept coming were of a heterodox and mystical or quasi-mystical orientation. And so it is no wonder that rather early, at the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and before, there was a considerable number of American leaders on the American continent who appeared to have been quite aware of the esoteric potential of this country and who exercised that. In this book you will find the exact quotations, some of them more than once, of the mysterious person. I mentioned him in one of our church services recently, the strange man who appeared in Philadelphia at the signing of the independence and who possibly persuaded the founding fathers to sign the declaration, and who subsequently, even though the doors were locked by that time, was never discovered who he was. And so there are incidents of an esoteric nature, even on the design of the first flag of the Union, many others, that all seem to indicate that there something was happening here that had its esoteric advocates, its esoteric representatives, and who moved the founding and then the recently founded republic in that direction. But so there is a great deal of evidence of a specific nature, but a general nature in which often is not mentioned, that I already brought up, and I think that is really of utmost importance, is that in order for us to become not only human, and human all too human, menschliches allzu menschliches, as we say in German, but to become more than ordinarily human, to truly bring forth into reality our interior potential. It is very important. It is absolutely important to live within a social structure where such developments are not only not discouraged, but perhaps even encouraged. And that is why you had really great esotericists like Benjamin Franklin and others right there at the founding, and always some development of that sort. I summarized. I have probably 100 quotations here that I collected, but they will have to wait for another time. But I summarized what I think is a very important and very valid thesis. This is the reason for American democracy, because the demos, the people, are encouraged and trained ultimately to rule themselves and not to depend on external authority. And so the discouragement of authoritarianism, of that sort of thing, was right there from the beginning, and this being an absolute necessity for the fulfillment of the esoteric calling. Obviously, it does not pertain everywhere. Obviously, there are various nuances, but what was intended here, according to all evidence, was the creation of a country, of a society which would be a fertile ground for the development of esoteric consciousness, of the mystical union, the mystical growth of the individual soul, if and when required, if and when desired. And this, I think, is of very great importance. Now, of course, you know, the presence of talented and trained and ambitious individuals in a society, in a country, will produce many results. And certainly the United States became the country of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution was the greatest creator of wealth, the greatest creator of those means which make for human well-being, as far as we know in human history. So there was something going on here. Talented people, industrious people, people who worked hard, and were also thinking hard and feeling hard, multiplied in this country. So let us say the creativity of American society, I think, was very largely facilitated by the kind of people who found this country, and then founded the nation, and who ultimately settled here. But we still need to look at where is, yes, the esoteric tradition poked its head out here and there, and I could read of innumerable organizations and people who were along those lines, and who were, you might say, spiritually fertilized this land. But we also need to take a little more somber view, perhaps, in conclusion, and that is that there are some requirements of the activities and the flourishing of the esoteric tradition anywhere. And what are those? There are some foundational elements of the human psyche. I'll just use a little example which tells the entire story. When the founders, and I have mentioned this before and probably will mention it again. So when the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, certainly a worthwhile organization that came to do a great deal of good, wrote to Carl Jung, and I saw at least one of the letters, and this particular gentleman outlined the various points that I had, so gave a pretty thorough rundown to C.G. Jung of what this new organization is intending to do. And Carl Jung wrote back to him, and what he wrote in essence was, that's all very good, and you're doing a good thing, but there's one thing that you need. You need to refer to and maintain a connection with the ultimate power. And then they put God into the works, so that, let us say, when there needs to be a basic metaphysical understanding. To the founders and the subsequent leaders of the American Republic, it was primarily the Bible. And a lot of it was from the Old Testament. To me, one of the dullest books of the Old Testament is Deuteronomy. If you want you want to read something that will put you to sleep, read it, And yet it was the most popular of the early leaders of the American Republic. Why, I can't tell you, but they had an interesting taste, let's put it that way. But let's see the biblical foundations. Why? Because they were really the only ones around, and they were solid. And so a society, a country needs a solid moral foundation, which in turn is connected with the spiritual reality. When that is no longer present, then the chances are that you're in trouble. And so I would like to raise my voice in saying that I am very strongly of the opinion that we are in trouble. And we are in trouble mainly because the foundational element of the spiritual, intellectual life of people has vanished. We live in a secular and atheistic society, and the chances of somehow bringing back a transcendental foundation for that don't seem to be very great. So we are like, and we say, but what about the New Age, and what about the flying saucers? Yeah, what about the flying saucers? Come on. But what about all of this? What about all this stuff that is supposed to be spiritual? If in the individual human psyche and in the collective, it does not rest on the recognition of a fundamentally transcendental order of universal being, then it's not worth a great deal. So we must somehow recover the foundational spiritual and moral elements which were very much present at the time of the founding of the Republic and which must be rediscovered again. If we don't do that, you can have Madame Blavatsky reborn, you can have Jesus come back, Moses, anybody, and we are not going to go anywhere. Why? Because the psychological stability of people who have an underlying understanding and orientation toward the transcendental is the inevitable foundation for any kind of mystical or esoteric activity. And again, it doesn't mean you have to believe in this, believe in that, believe in the Ten Commandments. It must be something that has sunk into you in the course of your childhood, in the course of your schooling, and that is there. You have a foundation, and upon that foundation then you can build. What are you going to build? Metaphorically speaking, you are going to build the ladder which Jacob saw in his dream in the Bible. See, I know a little bit of Bible too. And upon which the angels ascended and descended. Because you need something that in its foundational nature connects you with something beyond this world. Look around and you are not going to see any. So we are in a difficult situation. Yet there have been times of such spiritual aridity, lack of spiritual nourishment in the history of the world before, and they have been replaced by much, much better things. So that can be happening. But let us keep it in mind that a general spiritual religious foundation is the bedrock upon which the esoteric tradition is built. When it's not, that bedrock is not there, the esoteric is not going to prevail. So you don't start with reincarnation and karma and things like that. You start with, please don't be angry at me for the word. You start with God. You start with, you don't like the word God, be my guest. The divine, the transcendental, the holy order, the holy transhuman has to be there. It doesn't require a great deal. I am not asking people to believe in a God with a great big beard who smites Sodom and Gomorrah and floods the earth with the Sündflut, let's say, that's a German word for the flood, and things like that. But for a basic spiritual religious foundation. And this has to be recovered. So if at all possible, those of us, which I am sure is the truth in this case here, who are of an esoteric orientation, who are close to the esoteric tradition, remember that the exoteric has to be there as the foundational element of the esoteric. There cannot be anything internal unless there is something external. And I know that this is a disappointing statement, but it really shouldn't be, because about everything in life has to have a solid foundation. And I think we need to recover a solid foundation, and some of the greatest people in the esoteric movement, and I'm particularly referring to Manly Palmer Hall, were very, very insistent on that there must be a basic spiritual orientation, a basic belief in the transcendental in the populace before it can go on to greater things. You know, if there is no spirit, which is the Spirit of God, then what is going to reincarnate you reincarnationists? You know, what is going to reincarnate? So you have to have a feeling for what is happening, a feeling for the cosmic happening, a feeling for the transcendental plan, a feeling for that mysterious hidden glory that dwells within you, and it has to be a feeling more than anything else. You can read 1,000 books, you can memorize all kinds of things, but to a very large extent the esoteric tradition rests on a feeling-toned understanding of transcendence. And so here is a task for us to recover. We have to become a godly people again. And I don't mean any particular God, not the Jehovah God any more than Jupiter or Mars, but there has to be a recognition of the transcendental dimension, and it in turn will give rise to a need for spiritual practice. The heart of Greek religion, the Greek mysticism were the mysteries. If the mysteries weren't there, nothing else would be there. So there has to be an entry point, and an entry point is the transcendental orientation, which should be encouraged and should be present among the people. So I think we are in a critical period. The preconditions of the rebirth of the esoteric tradition, which certainly the people looked for earlier and when they came to this country, needs to be recovered. The materialism, the secularism of the age needs to diminish. The contact and the very idea of the desirability of the contact with something that exists, something that is real. If the divine is not real, nothing is real, absolutely nothing. We are not real. We are more unreal than the tiniest gnat in the air. Because it's the transcendental dimension that gives us life. Not the physical life that they are fighting about, another kind of life. The life that is the great life. The life that moves us into and out of the great worlds. The life that gives us meaning. This life needs to be there, needs to be rediscovered, needs to be cultivated, and if that happens, then everything will be right. And the dreams of the old ones, whether they were with the old British philosophers or anybody else, or the Rosicrucians in Württemberg or something like that, will come to be realized. Because if we can have a foundation for this transcendental orientation, the means will come, and not only we ourselves, but our country, our very continent upon which we live, the very world, the very globe upon which our continent is located, will all be enlightened and redeemed and glorified. The only people who can do it is ourselves. Let's reflect about it. Let's see what may be done, because the task is a task of consciousness. We have that consciousness, we can accomplish it, we can do what our forebears wanted us to do, so let's go ahead and do it, folks. Let's go ahead and do it.
It's crucial.
And that's it.